passaggio arriva Burgnich, pareggio di Burgnich.
He defended like iron and faded like smoke. That is how the story begins, and, in a way, how it ends. In the grainy film of the 1962nd, Inter Milan's blue-black stripes move like a phalanx across the San Siro grass, and at the heart of that moving wall stand two shadows made of steel, Armando Picchi and Tarcisio Burgnich. One reads the game like a chess grandmaster, the other collides with it like a locomotive. You remember the cold breath of Milan nights, the white chalk dust on Helenio Herrera's blackboard, the way a stadium can go silent just before a tackle you can hear from the top tier. And then you think of a hospital corridor years later, where the great captain's footsteps become whispers, where the man who marshaled Europe's fearsome forwards is reduced to an X-ray and a diagnosis that arrives too early for a life that had given so much. This is not a simple tale of trophies and clean sheets. It is a pact between two men who learn to trust in the geometry of suffering. One step, one interception, one unglamorous decision at a time. The headlines belong to goal scorers. The nights belong to them. When Inter conquered Europe, the cameras sought the goals. The victories, however, were minted in their small, brutal economies. The half-yard stolen from a striker, the shoulder placed with surgical cruelty, the silence after the danger is cleared. Burgnich, La Rochia, The Rock never needed poetry. Picchi supplied it anyway with his eyes, scanning, anticipating, commanding, without a raised voice. And yet, even in triumph, the clock was ticking. There were rumors of rifts, of the price of Herrera's discipline, of bodies pushed past their natural limits, of a captain who carried too much weight in his ribs and in his heart. Some legends retire, some are taken. Some fade gently, others vanish like smoke against the night sky over San Siro, leaving a defense line that still feels, decades later, like a prayer said in the language of iron. In the Italy of the 1962nd, football was more than a sport. It was a fortress for a country still stitching itself together from the wounds of war, a theater where entire generations poured their hopes, anxieties, and identities. At the heart of this fragile yet ambitious era stood Inter Milan, a team that would come to be known as La Grande Inter, sculpted by the iron hand of Helenio Herrera. His philosophy was discipline turned into religion, defense transformed into an art form, and within that sacred geometry of Catenaccio, two figures became inseparable, Armando Picchi and Tarcisio Burgnich. Picchi was the commander. Originally a right back at Spal and then at Inter, Herrera saw something more, a calmness under pressure, a clairvoyance in reading the rhythm of play, an almost priest-like authority in how he held the line. He shifted Picchi into the role of libero, the free defender behind the barricade, and in that position, the quiet Tuscan became a general. His eyes scanned the horizon, his voice carried the weight of command, and his courage absorbed the chaos of battle. Burgnich, by contrast, was not subtle. His nickname, La Rochia, said everything. Born in Friuli, shaped in the hard northern Italian tradition, he was strength in its purest form. Broad shoulders, fearless in the tackle, relentless in pursuit. If Picchi was the mind of the defense, Burgnich was its muscle. When strikers like Luis Suarez or Eusebio charged forward, they collided with the immovable figure of Burgnich. He was not elegant, but he was indispensable, and in Herrera's Inter, indispensability was everything. Together, they forged a defensive partnership that embodied an era. Italy was cautious, distrustful of flamboyance, yet desperate for results. Goals were precious, but victories were priceless. In this world, defenders became kings. To watch Picchi and Burgnich was to see two sides of the same coin, strategy and execution, intellect and intimidation, order and violence. They were guardians of Herrera's empire, the reason Inter could spring forward with such devastating counterattacks. Without them, the goals of Sandro Mazzola, Jair, or Suarez would never have mattered. But behind this steel wall lay cracks. Herrera's methods, praised and feared, demanded absolute obedience. Players lived under constant surveillance of disciplined curfews, psychological manipulation, endless tactical drills. Picchi, as captain, bore the brunt of this control. He was the bridge between a manager who wanted machines and a squad of men who longed to breathe. Rumors suggested that the burden weighed on him more heavily than the fans ever knew. He carried not just Inter's trophies, but also the invisible scars of Herrera's relentless grip. And yet the city adored them. In Milan, the San Siro roared for attackers, but it trusted defenders. When Picchi stepped onto the field, children saw a captain who looked like their fathers, stern, composed, unyielding. When Burgnich thundered into a tackle, they saw a man carved from their soil, unafraid to break bones to protect the badge. They symbolize not just Inter, but Italy itself, a nation trying to defend its place in a fast-changing Europe. Still, fate had already chosen its cruel script. For Burgnich, there would be longevity, a place in history books as a champion of Europe and the world. For Picchi, destiny was far shorter, far darker. The partnership that defined an era would be split, not by football, not by betrayal, but by the merciless hand of illness that cares little for loyalty, glory, or iron. The smoke was already gathering, even as the iron still held. Armando Picchi's rise was never about dazzling skills or spectacular goals. He was small by the standards of defenders, standing just over 1.70 meters, yet he carried a presence that towered above giants. At Spal and later at Inter, he learned to treat every inch of grass as sacred territory. When Herrera moved him into the libero role, many doubted he wasn't tall enough, he wasn't strong enough. And yet game after game, he silenced critics. He saw plays before they unfolded, intercepted balls like a prophet intercepting fate, and carried the air of a leader who would rather break himself than allow his team to break. By the mid-1962nd, Picchi wore the captain's armband, and Inter's dressing room moved to his rhythm. Beside him, Tarcisio Burgnich was the perfect counterbalance. Burgnich had already proven himself at Juventus and Palermo before arriving at Inter, but under Herrera he became a cornerstone. His nickname, La Roccia, was not bestowed lightly. When Pelé himself admitted that Burgnich was the only man who ever truly marked him out of a game, the legend was sealed. Picchi directed, Burgnich executed. One organized the battlefield, the other fought its bloodiest duels. From 1963 to 1966, Inter conquered Italy and Europe. 3 Serie A titles, 2 European Cups, 2 Intercontinental Cups. The San Siro became a fortress, and at its gate stood the 2 guardians. Newspapers across Europe spoke of Herrera's tactical genius, of Mazzola's creativity, of Suarez's vision, but in whispers, they admitted, without Picchi and Burgnich, it all collapsed. Yet the fall crept in quietly, as it often does in football. By 1967, Inter had lost the European crown to Celtic in Lisbon. It was not just a defeat, it was a humiliation. The Scottish press called it the end of Catenaccio. Fingers pointed inward. Some claimed Herrera's control had suffocated the team, others whispered of fractures in the dressing room. Picchi, as captain, bore the scrutiny. He had been Herrera's soldier, but now he was accused of being complicit in a system too rigid, too defensive, too drained of soul. The abnormal signs spread. Burgnich, though still a rock on the field, was beginning to feel the physical toll of endless battles. Inter's dynasty was cracking, and with it, the men who built its walls. In the background, Picchi faced another enemy. A persistent pain in his side, ignored for months, began to erode his strength. Doctors found what football had hidden, a malignant tumor near his ribs. For a man who had stared down Eusebio and Gigi Riva without flinching, the diagnosis was the first opponent he could not outthink, could not outfight. The press did not know, not at first. To the fans, Picchi was simply slowing, perhaps aging faster than expected. To his teammates, the silence around his health was louder than words. The captain who had once been the voice of command now walked slower to training, sometimes sitting alone in the shadows of Appiano Gentile. Herrera had left Inter by then, and with him the aura of invincibility. Picchi's illness was hidden, but the decline of the dynasty was visible to all. By the time the truth emerged, it was too late. Picchi retired far earlier than anyone expected. Burgnich fought on, extending his career at Napoli, even representing Italy in the 1970 World Cup final. But the partnership that had once defined Europe was already broken. The iron was still there in Burgnich's tackles, but the smoke had already begun to rise from Picchi's fading light. The real tragedy of Armando Picchi's story is that the world only discovered the truth when it was too late. For years, the captain who commanded Inter's defense with unshakable certainty had been fighting an invisible opponent inside his own body. At first it was discomfort, brushed aside as the aches of a footballer in his 30s. But then came the fatigue that no rest could fix, the cough that lingered, the sudden weight loss hidden beneath suits and sweaters. In the hypermasculine world of 1,960-second calcio, where weakness was shame and silence was survival, Picchi said little. He had built a career on being unbreakable, and he refused to let the cracks show. Behind closed doors, the truth was merciless. Doctors diagnosed a malignant tumor in his rib cage. In the language of medicine, it was clinical, detached. In the reality of a 3-4-year-old man who had lifted European cups to the skies, it was a death sentence. Friends recalled the visit's teammates arriving at the hospital, unprepared to see the once imposing captain reduced to a pale, frail figure. Some described his smile, still stubborn, as though defying fate itself. Others admitted they could not stay long in the room. The contrast between memory and reality was too devastating. Burgnich would later confess that watching Picchi's decline was like watching part of Inter itself dissolve. They had been a pair forged in steel, and suddenly one half was disappearing into smoke. The locker room was muted. The same voices that had once cheered in Lisbon, in Madrid, in Milan, now fell into whispers whenever his name was mentioned. Football can be ruthless in moving on. Inter had to keep playing, had to keep defending, while their captain was confined to hospital corridors. The press eventually reported the illness, but Italy in 1970 did not speak of cancer the way we do today. It was hushed, almost taboo, a private shame rather than a public battle. Picchi himself refused pity. "I am not afraid," he is said to have whispered once, though no one knows if he meant it. What he feared most, perhaps, was being forgotten, disappearing from the game he had given everything to. And yet, in that cruel irony, the illness made him unforgettable. He became the fallen captain, the warrior struck down not by defeat on the field, but by something darker, untouchable, unavoidable. On May 27, 1971, Armando Picchi passed away at just 35 years old. The funeral in San Remo was heavy with silence. Teammates who had once stood beside him in San Siro now stood by his coffin, unable to comprehend how a man so strong, so commanding, could vanish so quickly. For Burgnich, it was the loss of a brother in arms. For Inter, it was the breaking of a bond that no new player could replace. For Italian football, it was a reminder that behind the myth of Catenaccio, behind the trophies and tactics, were human beings with bodies that could betray them, hearts that could break, lives that could end too soon. The dark truth was not just his illness. It was that even legends are mortal, and sometimes their greatest battles are fought in silence, unseen by the world they once ruled. Looking back at the intertwined fates of Armando Picchi and Tarcisio Burgnich, it is tempting to see only the medals, the trophies, the iron wall of Catenaccio that stood unbroken for nearly a decade. But to stop there would be dishonest, because hidden beneath the banners and parades is a question that cannot be ignored. Was this partnership a triumph of human will, or a sacrifice to a system that demanded too much from its soldiers? Picchi in many ways embodied the contradictions of Italian football in the 1962nd. He was celebrated as the perfect captain, yet burdened by Herrera's authoritarian grip. He was the shield of Inter's glory, yet abandoned to fight his own illness in silence. His early death at 35 is not only a personal tragedy, it exposes how little protection the game offered to its own icons. Was Picchi merely unlucky, or was he a victim of an environment that treated players like machines until their bodies broke down? Burgnich, too, raises difficult questions. His legacy as La Rocha, the Rock, is secure. He marked Pele, he lifted trophies, he carried Inter and later Napoli. But his career also speaks to the cost of relentless duty. How many injuries were concealed? How many nights were spent under Herrera's curfews, living like a soldier instead of a man? The fans saw the tackles, the victories, but rarely the toll of living inside a tactical cage where personal freedom was secondary to collective obedience. From this channel's perspective, the Picchi Burgnich story is not just about defending football's past, it is about defending the men behind the myth. When we romanticize Grande Inter, we must also acknowledge the fragility hidden behind its steel. The iron was real, but so was the smoke. Picchi's death confronts us with the uncomfortable truth that legends can vanish without warning, leaving behind questions that echo louder than their triumphs. Was Armando Picchi a wasted genius, extinguished too soon, or a victim of a brutal system that consumed men as fuel for glory? Did we lose him too early, or did the game itself lose a part of its humanity in the way it treated him? These questions are not meant to tarnish Inter's golden era. They are meant to honor it honestly, to see both the iron and the smoke, the rock and the cracks. Only by looking at both sides can we truly understand the weight these men carried and the price they paid to etch their names into history. Time has a way of softening even the hardest lines, of turning scars into stories and tragedies into myths. Today, when Inter fans speak of the 1962nd, they do so with reverence, as if recalling a sacred age when Grande Inter stood taller than any rival in Europe. And at the core of those memories, two names resurface like echoes carved in stone: Armando Picchi and Tarcisio Burgnich. Picchi's death at 35 froze him in eternal youth. He remains the captain who never aged, the leader who lifted trophies but never saw his hair turn gray in the dugout or the boardroom. That absence is its own presence. Every Inter supporter who hears his name feels both pride and grief, as though the club's golden era was sealed not just by victory, but by loss. He became a symbol of fragility within strength, proof that even the greatest can be taken too soon. Burgnich's legacy is different, but no less enduring. He lived long enough to tell his story, to reflect on being La Rocha, to remember marking Pele and standing shoulder to shoulder with Picchi. His survival allowed him to embody continuity, a living link to Herrera's empire. And yet, in interviews late in life, even Burgnich admitted that something died with Picchi, that without his captain, the fortress was never the same. Together, they leave behind more than clean sheets and silverware. They leave behind a lesson in partnership, in trust, in sacrifice. Their story reminds us that football is not just about the men who score goals, but about the men who prevent them. Men who give everything, often without applause, often at great personal cost. As the years pass, the stadium lights fade, and new generations wear the blue and black. The ghosts of Picchi and Burgnich still patrol the San Siro. One is eternal rock, the other eternal smoke. One endured, the other vanished too soon. But together, they built a wall that history itself cannot break. And perhaps that is the true legacy, that even in absence, they remain present, that even in silence, they are remembered. Because some stories were never meant to vanish, and now you know theirs.